Advent of Portuguese to India. After the decline of the Roman Empire in the 7th century, the Arabs had established their domination in Egypt and Persia. Direct contact between the Europeans and India declined, and, with that, the easy accessibility to the Indian commodities like spices, calicos, silk, and various precious stones that were greatly in demand was affected. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, who were on the ascendant. Merchandise from India went to the European markets through Arab-Muslim intermediaries. The Red Sea trade route was a state monopoly from which Islamic rulers earned tremendous revenues. The land routes to India were also controlled by the Arabs. In the circumstances, the Europeans were keen to find a direct sea route to India. 15th century Europe was gripped by the spirit of the Renaissance, with its call for exploration. At the same time, Europe made great advances in the art of shipbuilding and navigation. Hence, there was an eagerness all over Europe for adventurous sea voyages to reach the unknown corners of the East. The economic development of many regions of Europe was also progressing rapidly with expansion of land under cultivation, the introduction of an improved plow, scientific crop management such as crop rotation, and increased supply of meat which called for spices for cooking as well as for preservation. Prosperity also grew, and with it, the demand for Oriental luxury goods also increased. Venice and Genoa, which had earlier prospered through trade in Oriental goods, were too small to take on the mighty Ottoman Turks or to take up major exploration on their own. The North Europeans were ready to aid Portugal and Spain with money and men, even as the Genoese were ready to provide ships and technical knowledge. It is also to be noted that Portugal had assumed the leadership in Christendom's resistance to Islam, even as it had taken on itself the spirit of exploration that had characterized the Genoese. Historians have observed that the idea of finding an ocean route to India had become an obsession for Prince Henry of Portugal, who was nicknamed the Navigator also. He was keen to find a way to circumvent the Muslim domination of the Eastern Mediterranean and all the routes that connected India to Europe. Pope Nicholas V gave Prince Henry a bull in 1454, conferring on him the right to navigate the sea to the distant shores of the Orient, more specifically, as far as India, in an attempt to fight Islamic influence and spread the Christian faith. However, Prince Henry died before his dream became a reality. In 1497, under the Treaty Tordesillas, 1494, the rulers of Portugal and Spain divided the non-Christian world between them by an imaginary line in the Atlantic, some 1,300 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. Under the treaty, Portugal could claim and occupy everything to the east of the line, while Spain could claim everything to the west. The situation was thus prepared for the Portuguese incursions into the waters around India. It was in 1487 that the Portuguese navigator, Bartholomew Dias, rounded the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and sailed up the eastern coast. He was well convinced that the long-sought-after sea route to India had been found. But it was only 10 years later that an expedition of Portuguese ships set out for India in 1497 and arrived in India in slightly less than 11 months' time in May 1498. From trading to ruling, Vasco da Gama, the arrival of 3 ships under Vasco da Gama, led by a Gujarati pilot named Abdul Majid, at Calicut in May 1498, profoundly affected the course of Indian history. The Hindu ruler of Calicut, the Zamorin, Samuthiri, however, had no apprehensions as to the Europeans' intentions. As the prosperity of his kingdom was due to Calicut's position as an entrepot, he accorded a friendly reception to Vasco da Gama. The Arab traders, who had a good business on the Malabar coast, were apprehensive and were not keen on the Portuguese getting a hold there. For centuries, the trading system in the Indian Ocean had had numerous participants: Indians, Arabs, Africans from the East Coast, Chinese, Javanese, among others. But these participants had acted according to some tacit rules of conduct, and none had sought overwhelming dominance, though all were in it for profit. The Portuguese changed that they wanted to monopolize the hugely profitable Eastern trade by excluding competitors, especially the Arabs. Vasco da Gama stayed in India for 3 months. When he returned to Portugal, he carried back with him a rich cargo and sold the merchandise in the European market at a huge profit. The importance of direct access to the pepper trade was made clear by the fact that elsewhere, the Europeans, who had to buy through Muslim middlemen, would have had to spend 10 times as much for the same amount of pepper. Not surprisingly, other profit-seeking merchants of European nations were tempted to come to India and trade directly. A voyage was undertaken by Pedro Alvarez Cabral to trade for spices. He negotiated and established a factory at Calicut, where he arrived in September 1500. There was an incident of conflict when the Portuguese factory at Calicut was attacked by the locals, resulting in the death of several Portuguese. In retaliation, Cabral seized a number of Arab merchant ships anchored in the harbor and killed hundreds of their crew. Besides confiscating their cargo and burning the ships, Calicut was bombarded by Cabral. Later, Cabral succeeded in making advantageous treaties with the local rulers of Cochin and Cananor. Vasco da Gama once again came to India in 1501. The Zamorin declined to exclude the Arab merchants in favor of the Portuguese when Vasco da Gama combined commercial greed with ferocious hostility and wreaked vengeance on Arab shipping wherever he could. His rupture with the Zamorin thus became total and complete. Vasco da Gama set up a trading factory at Cananor. Gradually, Calicut, Cananor, and Cochin became the important trade centers of the Portuguese. Gradually, under the pretext of protecting the factories and their trading activities, the Portuguese got permission to fortify these centers. Francisco de Almeida. In 1505, the King of Portugal appointed a governor in India for a 3-year term and equipped the incumbent with sufficient force to protect the Portuguese interests. Francisco de Almeida, the newly appointed governor, was asked to consolidate the position of the Portuguese in India and to destroy Muslim trade by seizing Aden, Ormuz, and Malacca. He was also advised to build fortresses at Anjadiva, Cochin, Cananore, and Kilwa. What Almeida, however, encountered along with the opposition of the Zamorin was a threat from the Mameluke Sultan of Egypt. Encouraged by the merchants of Venice, whose lucrative commerce was now at risk due to the Portuguese interference, the Egyptians raised a fleet in the Red Sea to stop the advance of the Portuguese. In 1507, the Portuguese squadron was defeated in a naval battle off Diu by the combined Egyptian and Gujarat navies, and Almeida's son was killed. Next year, Almeida avenged his defeat by totally crushing the two navies. Almeida's vision was to make the Portuguese the master of the Indian Ocean. His policy was known as the Blue Water Policy, Cartaz system. Alfonso de Albuquerque. Alfonso de Albuquerque, who succeeded Almeida as the Portuguese governor in India, was the real founder of the Portuguese power in the East, a task he completed before his death. He secured for Portugal the strategic control of the Indian Ocean by establishing bases overlooking all the entrances to the sea. There were Portuguese strongholds in East Africa, off the Red Sea, at Ormuz, in Malabar, and at Malacca. The Portuguese, under Albuquerque, bolstered their stranglehold by introducing a permit system for other ships and exercising control over the major shipbuilding centers in the region. The non-availability of timber in the Gulf and Red Sea regions for shipbuilding also helped the Portuguese in their objectives. Albuquerque acquired Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur in 1510 with ease. The principal port of the Sultan of Bijapur became the first bit of Indian territory to be under the Europeans since the time of Alexander the Great. An interesting feature of his rule was the abolition of sati. The Portuguese men who had come on the voyages and stayed back in India were, from Albuquerque's day, encouraged to take local wives. In Goa and the province of the north, they established themselves as village landlords, often building new roads and irrigation works, introducing new crops like tobacco and cashew nut, or better plantation varieties of coconut, besides planting large groves of coconut to meet the need for quail rigging and cordage. In the cities, such as Goa and Cochin, they settled as artisans and master craftsmen, besides being traders. Most of such Portuguese came to look upon their new settlements, rather than Portugal, as home. Nino da Cunha. Nino da Cunha assumed office of the governor of Portuguese interests in India in November 1529, and almost 1 year later shifted the headquarters of the Portuguese government in India from Cochin to Goa. Bahadur Shah of Gujarat, during his conflict with the Mughal Emperor Humayun, secured help from the Portuguese by ceding to them in 1534 the island of Bassein with its dependencies and revenues. He also promised them a base in Diu. However, Bahadur Shah's relations with the Portuguese became sour when Humayun withdrew from Gujarat in 1536. Since the inhabitants of the town started fighting with the Portuguese, Bahadur Shah wanted to raise a wall of partition. Opposing this, the Portuguese started negotiations, in the course of which the ruler of Gujarat was invited to a Portuguese ship and killed in 1537. Da Cunha also attempted to increase Portuguese influence in Bengal by settling many Portuguese nationals there with Hoogly as their headquarters. Favorable conditions for Portuguese. In India, excepting Gujarat, which was ruled by the powerful Mahmud Begharha, 1458–1511, the northern part was much divided among many small powers. In the Deccan, the Bahmani kingdom was breaking up into smaller kingdoms. None of the powers had a navy worth its name, nor did they think of developing their naval strength. In the Far East, the imperial decree of the Chinese emperor limited the navigational reach of the Chinese ships. As regards the Arab merchants and ship owners who until then dominated the Indian Ocean trade, they had nothing to match the organization and unity of the Portuguese. Moreover, the Portuguese had cannons placed on their ships. Portuguese State. The general tendency is to underestimate the Portuguese hold in India. However, the Estado Português de India state of the Portuguese India was in fact a larger element in Indian history than it is given credit for. Many of the coastal parts of India had come under Portuguese power within 50 years of Vasco da Gama's arrival. The Portuguese had occupied some 60 miles of coast around Goa. On the west coast, from Mumbai to Daman and Diu to the approaches to Gujarat, they controlled a narrow tract with 4 important ports and hundreds of towns and villages. In the south, they had under them a chain of seaport fortresses and trading posts like Mangalore, Cannanore, Cochin, and Calicut. And though their power in Malabar was not consolidated, it was enough to ensure influence or control over the local rulers who held the spice-growing land. The Portuguese established further military posts and settlements on the east coast at San Tome, in Chennai, and Nagapatnam, in Andhra. Towards the end of the 16th century, a wealthy settlement had grown at Hoogly in West Bengal. Envoys and ambassadors were exchanged between Goa and many of the major kingdoms in India of the time. Treaties were signed between Goa and the Deccan sultans in 1570, which were regularly renewed as long as their kingdoms lasted. The Portuguese always had a role to play in the successive battles for the balance of power between Vijayanagara and the Deccan sultans, between the Deccanis and the Mughals, and between the Mughals and the Marathas. Interestingly, the Portuguese, the first Europeans to come to India, were also the last to leave this land. It was 1961 before the government of India recaptured Goa, Daman, and Diu from them. Portuguese administration in India. The head of the administration was the viceroy, who served for 3 years, with his secretary, and in later years, a council. Next in importance came the Veedor da Fazenda, responsible for revenues and the cargoes and dispatch of fleets. The fortresses, from Africa to China, were under captains, assisted by factors whose power was increased by the difficulties of communication and was too often used for personal ends. Religious policy of the Portuguese, the Moors, were the bitter enemies of the Portuguese in North Africa. So were the Arabs. Arriving in the East, the Portuguese brought with them the same zeal to promote Christianity and the wish to persecute all Muslims. Intolerant towards the Muslims, the Portuguese were initially quite tolerant towards the Hindus. However, over time, after the introduction of the Inquisition in Goa, there was a change, and Hindus were also persecuted. But, in spite of this intolerant behavior, the Jesuits made a good impression at the court of Akbar, mainly due to the Mughal emperor's interest in questions of theology. In September 1579, Akbar forwarded a letter to the authorities at Goa requesting them to send 2 learned priests. The church authorities in Goa eagerly accepted the invitation, seeing in it a chance to convert the emperor to Christianity, and with him, his court and the people. Jesuit fathers, Rodolfo Acquaviva and Antonio Monserrate, were selected for the purpose. When they reached Fatehpur Sikri on February 28, 1580, they were received with honor. Acquaviva and Monserrate went back in 1583, belying the hopes the Portuguese entertained of Akbar's conversion to the Christian faith. The second mission, called by Akbar in 1590, also ended on a similar note in 1592. The third mission, again invited by Akbar, arrived in 1595 at Lahore, where the court was then residing, and continued as a sort of permanent institution, thereby extending its influence on secular politics. Fathers Jerome Xavier and Emmanuel Pinheiro were the leaders of the mission, and their letters from the court became very widely known for the information they provided on the later part of Akbar's reign. Prince Salim, on ascending the throne as Jahangir, assuaged the Muslims by neglecting the Jesuit fathers. Gradually, however, his temporary estrangement from the Jesuits ended, and in 1606 he renewed his favors to them. The elegant and spacious church at Lahore was allowed to be retained by them along with the collegium or the priest's residence. In 1608, 20 baptisms were carried out in Agra, the priests publicly acting with as much liberty as in Portugal. Jahangir's conduct was such that the Jesuit priests became hopeful of bringing him within the Christian fold. However, these hopes were belied. Moreover, arrogant actions on the part of the Portuguese viceroys created a rift with the Mughal emperor. Portuguese lose favor with the Mughals. In 1608, Captain William Hawkins with his ship Hector reached Surat. He brought with him a letter from James I, King of England, to the Mughal court of Jahangir, requesting permission to do business in India. Father Pinheiro and the Portuguese authorities did their best to prevent Hawkins from reaching the Mughal court, but did not succeed. Jahangir accepted the gifts Hawkins brought for him and gave Hawkins a very favorable reception in 1609. As Hawkins knew the Turkey language well, he conversed with the emperor in that language without the aid of an interpreter. Pleased with Hawkins, Jahangir appointed him as a mansabdar of 400 at a salary of Rs. $30,000. Apparently, he never received it. Hawkins was also married to the daughter of an Armenian Christian named Mubarak Shah Mubarakesha. The grant of trading facilities to the English offended the Portuguese. However, after negotiations, a truce was established between the Portuguese and the Mughal emperor. The Portuguese stopped the English ships from entering the port of Surat. A baffled Hawkins left the Mughal court in 1611, unable to counter the Portuguese intrigues or check the vacillating Mughal policies. However, in November 1612, the English ship Dragon under Captain Best, along with a little ship, the Osiander, successfully fought a Portuguese fleet. Jahangir, who had no navy worth its name, learnt of the English success and was greatly impressed. The Portuguese acts of piracy also resulted in conflict with the imperial Mughal government. In 1613, the Portuguese offended Jahangir by capturing Mughal ships, imprisoning many Muslims, and plundering the cargoes. An enraged Jahangir ordered Muqarrab Khan, who was then in charge of Surat, to obtain compensation. However, it was during the reign of Shah Jahan that the advantages which the Portuguese enjoyed in the Mughal court were lost forever. Also lost were the hopes of converting the royal family and Mughal India to Christianity, a hope that the Portuguese held because of the welcome accorded to them and their religion by Akbar and Jahangir. Capture of Hoogly. On the basis of an imperial farman circa 1579, the Portuguese had settled down on a riverbank, which was a short distance from Satgaon in Bengal, to carry on their trading activities. Over the years, they strengthened their position by constructing big buildings, which led to the migration of the trade from Satgaon to the new port known as Hoogly. They monopolized the manufacture of salt, built a custom house of their own, and started enforcing strictly the levy of duty on tobacco, which had become an important article of trade since its introduction at the beginning of the 17th century. The Portuguese not only made money as traders, but Christians also started a cruel slave trade by purchasing or seizing Hindu and Muslim children, whom they brought up as in the course of their nefarious activities. They seized 2 slave girls of Mumtaz Mahal. On June 24, 1632, the Mughal siege of Hoogly began, ending in its capture 3 months later. Shah Jahan ordered the Bengal governor Qasim Khan to take action against the Portuguese. The siege of Hoogly finally led to the Portuguese fleeing. The Mughals suffered a loss of 1,000 men, but also took 400 prisoners to Agra. The prisoners were offered the option to convert to Islam or become slaves. The persecution of Christians continued for some time, after which it died down gradually. Decline of the Portuguese. By the 18th century, the Portuguese in India lost their commercial influence, though some of them still carried on trade in their individual capacity, and many took to piracy and robbery. In fact, Hoogly was used by some Portuguese as a base for piracy in the Bay of Bengal. The decline of the Portuguese was brought about by several factors. The local advantages gained by the Portuguese in India were reduced with the emergence of powerful dynasties in Egypt, Persia, and North India, and the rise of the turbulent Marathas as their immediate neighbors. The Marathas captured Salsette and Bassein in 1739 from the Portuguese. The religious policies of the Portuguese, such as the activities of the Jesuits, gave rise to political fears. Their antagonism for the Muslims apart, the Portuguese policy of conversion to Christianity made Hindus also resentful. Their dishonest trade practices also evoked a strong reaction. The Portuguese earned notoriety as sea pirates. Their arrogance and violence brought them the animosity of the rulers of small states and the imperial Mughals. The discovery of Brazil diverted colonizing activities of Portugal to the west as well. The union of the 2 kingdoms of Spain and Portugal in 1580–81, dragging the smaller kingdom into Spain's wars with England and Holland, badly affected Portuguese monopoly of trade in India. The earlier monopoly of knowledge of the sea route to India, held by the Portuguese, could not remain a secret forever. Soon enough, the Dutch and the English, who were learning the skills of ocean navigation, also learnt of it. As new trading communities from Europe arrived in India, there began a fierce rivalry among them. In this struggle, the Portuguese had to give way to the more powerful and enterprising competitors. The Dutch and the English had greater resources and more compulsions to expand overseas, and they overcame the Portuguese resistance. One by one, the Portuguese possessions fell to its opponents. Goa, which remained with the Portuguese, had lost its importance as a port after the fall of the Vijayanagara Empire, and soon it did not matter in whose possession it was. The spice trade came under the control of the Dutch, and Goa was superseded by Brazil as the economic center of the overseas empire of Portugal. In 1683, after 2 naval assaults, the Marathas invaded Goa. Significance of the Portuguese. Most historians have observed that the coming of the Portuguese not only initiated what might be called the European era, it marked the emergence of naval power. The Cholas, among others, had been a naval power, but it was now for the first time a foreign power had come to India by way of the sea. The Portuguese ships carried cannon, and this was the first step in gaining monopoly over trade with the threat or actual use of force. The Portuguese declared their intention to abide by no rules except their own, and they were intent on getting a decisive advantage over the Indians and over the Indian Ocean trading system. In the Malabar of the 16th century, the Portuguese showed military innovation in their use of body armor, matchlock men, and guns landed from the ships. The Portuguese may have contributed by example to the Mughal use of field guns and the artillery of the stirrup. However, an important military contribution made by the Portuguese on shore was the system of drilling groups of infantry on the Spanish model introduced in the 1630s as a counter to Dutch pressure. The practice was adopted first by the French and English, and later taken up by the Marathas and Sikhs, and such armies of sepoys became new tools of empire in India. The Portuguese were masters of improved techniques at sea. Their multi-decked ships were heavily constructed and designed as they were to ride out Atlantic gales rather than run before the regular monsoons. This permitted them to carry a heavier armament. Their use of castled prow and stern was a noteworthy method by which to repel or launch boarding parties. Indian builders adapted both to their own use. However, the Portuguese skill at organization, as in the creation of royal arsenals and dockyards, and the maintenance of a regular system of pilots, and mapping and pitting state forces against private merchant shipping, was even more noteworthy. The Mughals and Marathas may certainly have learnt from the Portuguese, but the more certain heirs of this knowledge were other Europeans, especially the Dutch and English in Asia. In India, the memory of religious persecution and cruelty detracts from the other contributions made by the Portuguese in the cultural field. However, it cannot be forgotten that the missionaries and the church were also teachers and patrons in India of the arts of the painter, carver, and sculptor. As in music, they were the interpreters, not just of Portuguese, but of European art to India. The art of the silversmith and goldsmith flourished at Goa, and the place became a center of elaborate filigree work, fretted foliage work, and metal work embedding jewels. However, though the interior of churches built under the Portuguese have plenty of woodwork and sculpture, and sometimes painted ceilings, they are generally simple in their architectural plan. Thank you.